Many millennials and Gen Z are afraid of having kids.
It's a boy!
Because they feel like their life will be compromised. And then once you have a kid, they're afraid to have a second and a third and a fourth kid. And us having 3 kids, people are constantly shocked of like, hey, how are you gonna handle 3 kids? And let me tell you, kids scale really well, just like startups. A lot of people are afraid about growth and change, and that's understandable. And as people, we're all often like fearful of things. But at the end of the day, certain things scale well and certain things scale poorly. As an example, service businesses scale poorly. The bigger you get, the more people you have to hire, the more people you have to hire, more operational and logistical and HR issues you'll face. Tech companies, which is a common form of startups too, they scale well. Like one person can build a big business, especially now with AI. And I often think when I think of startups, being a startup founder myself, is that kids are very similar. If we haven't met, I'm Taro. I'm a founder of a company called Four Sigmatic. We're one of the first mushroom companies. We disrupted not just the health and wellness space, but also the coffee industry. Our coffee is regularly like a top 3 ground coffee on Amazon. We're top 3 or 5 coffee in US retail in the natural product space. We disrupted large, massive, multi-billion-dollar coffee companies. And when we started, there was a lot of work that went in that didn't show up on the scoreboard. Whenever you create a new category and you create a new habit, there's a lot of work and a lot of like juxtaposition that you have to do both in education, formulation, form factors. If you're interested in this topic, I did an interview on Ryan Morin's podcast about this. If you want to check out the clips about just creating a blue ocean strategy. Once I started having kids, we now have 3 kids with my wife. When we went from like no kids and we both love to travel and see the world, from 1 to 2 and then now 2 to 3, it's become obvious to me that kids scale well. I often get people that are like afraid of both business and kids, and they comment to me is like, oh, how can you handle a startup and all that work? And partially because startups scale well. So initially, yes, there's a lot of work, but then it gets going. Similarly with families, I've had so many people, it's like, how are you gonna handle 2 kids? Wow. I mean, our grandparents had like 10. But like today, having 3 kids is seen as this massive challenge. And I think there's some truth to it. There is definitely like the gauntlet of having kids and sleep training, potty training, this and that. But at the same time, I've come to realize that kids scale incredibly well. What do I mean with this? Is that I actually think that the hardest part transition with kids is going from 0 to 1, because you have to give up a lot of like your so-called freedoms and trade it up for taking care of the kid. You're also learning a lot. You're learning for the first time how to sleep train and potty train and change diapers and this and that. And there's like a learning curve. Yes, you have the luxury of being on power play in a way that there's 2 versus 1. So in a way, if one of you wants to go to the gym and take a break, it's super easy. Or if in an airplane, one of you has to go to the bathroom, it's super easy. There's just 1 kid. But for most people, going from 0 to 1 is a massive change. Now you're excited about it maybe, and that might make it a little bit easier.
Oh my God, I want a boy or a little girl, definitely one or the other.
But for most families, ourselves and our friends, 0 to 1 is a massive life change. Going from 1 to 2 is hard, but less hard. You have 100% of the work on the first kid, the next kid is 50% of the work. Now, the total work is still 150, and for that reason, it can feel overwhelming. But at the same time, like there is a lot of stuff that overlaps. Like if you're doing something with 1 kid, you can do it with 2 kids with almost no extra work. And for that reason, going from power play to man coverage is like, it's a shift, but it's not as big of a shift than from having none to having 1. If you're gonna have 1 kid, might as well have 2. If you're gonna have 3, might as well have 4. That's what people say. But once you have a third one, now you're playing zone.
Whoa, I don't play defense.
Yes, it's a chaos. But at this point, even if it's the chaos, you're like used to the chaos and you can handle it, I think, much better and easier. We don't have a 4 or 5 or 6, but seems like now the older kid is starting to help with the younger kids, and it's starting to kind of become like you got to race the first and the second, and then they race the following 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And in that case, like there's a lot of help that comes from that. And then from the younger kids learning from the older kids and by example. So there's less to manage, and most likely you're also better. I think when you start a company, and if you would inherit a big company, you would not be equipped. Well, most startup founders would not be equipped to run a bigger business, even an emerging business. But the whole point is that you slowly learn along the way by doing every role in the company and then delegating onwards. So then by the time you are a $100 million business, you're ready to run it because you've like learned along the way on what are the skills needed. You just needed to reinvent yourself multiple times. Now I have to say there are a few clear exceptions or disclaimers that I have to say. The age difference makes a huge difference. Like if your kids are really close to each other, yes, then going from 1 to 2 can be hard because like you're trying to sleep train 2 at the same time and they're in different nap schedules and can be chaotic. That was what we did. Our kids are very close in age, but then they start to play with each other on a later date versus if you have a huge age gap between the kids, then by the time the second one comes or the third one comes, the oldest is super ready to help, but then you've stretched it a long time. So pros and cons with age. Similarly, what's their health? Now, if one of them is sick, that will obviously probably make it harder. So I'm talking generalities and assuming everybody's healthy, or what else is going on in your life, a bankruptcy or this and that, or death in the family, or you're building a house, then yeah, sure, the third might be hardest because you're building a house. But in general, I would say kids and startups scale well. They're meant to be scaled, and the further you get, almost easier it gets. And a lot of the work is done upfront. You're just not getting credit for it. But once you have more kids, the greater it gets. This might be a small signal, but I've started to notice that people are more receptive to big families again versus maybe the last couple generations. There was a trend to have smaller and smaller families. And now since like the early 70s, the first time like size of families are going up and people are appreciative of the value of a family and the beauty of kids. And they understand that like sacrificing your whole life to an office career without having kids might not be the happiest and best choice for you or many people. The idea of amount of kids also scales up or down pretty scary once you compound multiple generations. For example, in South Korea, there's said to be that for every 100 South Koreans, there will only be 4.3 grandchildren, which is kind of scary, and how quickly 100 people will end up being 4.3 at the current pace. At the same time, like it compounds up too, is like if you have more than 3 kids and suddenly you have so many cousins, and how the size of the family compounds is not uncommon in places like Italy, where the grandmother's 100th birthday and there is like 200-300 grandchildren, which is pretty wild. But it goes up and down, and I think that's also the power and the scary part about how many kids you have, is that just going 1 or 2 generations, like 100 years onwards, population can explode a lot or decline a lot. And I think it's both in different parts on Earth, and certain societies will explode and have more people, and certain places will decline dramatically. And we're already seeing that in a bunch of countries. Does this mean you need to have a lot of kids? Absolutely not. Obviously, the world population is probably sometime soon going to peak and then start going down. Most Western nations are already on the decline, and we're left with countries like Nigeria responsible for population growth. And I think China, the dip has already kind of started to happen. So I think it would be great to have more people on Earth versus we've been taught the last 30, 40 years that there's too many people. But no, you don't have to have more kids. I'm just saying is that there's a lot of fears that parents have about having more kids. If they can't handle 1, how are they going to handle 2? If they can't handle 2, how are they going to have 3? And it just seems like the case is that you figure it out and it just gets easier as you go. Similarly with startups, like making your first 100K is so much work, so much work. So the idea that somebody makes $1 million or 10 million or 100 million is just like mind blowing. It's like, how do they do it? Like, or you say it's easy for them because they're XYZ. But everybody started at the low end, and you're building your first 1,000 true fans or first 1,000 customers. It takes a while. Similarly as building a YouTube channel, like the first 1,000 super fans is the hardest to get. And getting there, it's a lot of work. And then you start building momentum and it starts to get easy. It's not easy, but it's easier. And every incremental unit takes less work. And that's why I feel about kids. Every incremental child is slightly less work than the previous. Obviously, if they're really close in age, the totality of the work is pretty high and can be overwhelming initially. But then once they're a little bit older, seems like past 3 or 4 years old, it starts to get easier. And then, yeah, teenage seems to be another different gauntlet.
I think I hit puberty.
Okay, so I've made my argument that kids and startups scale well, but I think it's important that we hear a woman's perspective, because at the end of the day, a woman does like 95% of the work. And for that reason, I wanted to have my beautiful wife, Cora, that you might have seen in some of my other videos, to talk about the pros and cons of having more kids. How are you feeling?
Let's having another kid?
How are you feeling today?
Today I feel really good.
Okay.
Depends how much sleep I get, right?
Yeah.
It's a daily check-in.
How often do you feel good?
I would say 90% of the time.
Yeah.
And when I don't feel good, I just tell myself tomorrow's another day.
Yeah, that's true. So we now have 3 kids. Our oldest is 3.5, Middle one is almost 2. And then this little nugget is 5 months or so. If you go back in time when you had 1 kid, how did you feel about having 1 kid?
I think about this daily. I thought 1 kid was so hard. Did you?
At least in the beginning, yeah. Do you feel like most parents who just have 1 kid feel like it's very hard? Do you think
Yes.
our experience was common?
No, I think most people think 1 kid is so hard if they only have 1. And that probably stops a lot of people from having more than 1. But what they don't realize is 1 + 1 doesn't actually equal 2 always. And 2 + 1 doesn't always equal 3. So I remember times when we had 1 kid where I needed a nanny, but the amount of work it took to hire a nanny felt so overwhelming. Remember, I delegated that job to you. I couldn't even. And now it's so crazy the amount of things I do with 3 kids.
When I meet people with 1 kid, they're often even amazed when we had 2 kids, let alone 3. And I always think back to my grandparents, and they were like, everybody had like 5 to 15 children.
Yeah.
I was like, so how is 2 now this?
2 now feels hard. Yeah.
Yeah, and people are wealthier and they have more tools and technology, and there's all these things that didn't exist then, but people imagine like 2 kids being a lot versus back then maybe 15 kids was a lot.
I think people are soft now. And I also think the people who feel like it's a lot are usually the people who hire a bunch of help. And I think maybe that's one of the biggest things is if you don't know how to do it on your own, you've never had to, you've always had a mother-in-law or nanny or someone, you are kind of limited in your capacity because you don't know how much you can take on. But people who end up doing it all on their own, you kind of feel like you can do anything. After you've been alone with 3 kids one day, you're like, oh, no, I can do it. It's super easy.
Yeah. And to the video's theme about kids and startups scale well, I think one of the reasons is that most founders have to do every job in the company at some point. There's also founders who raise a lot of money out of the gates and they never do the job themselves and they delegate it all. And those companies, in my experience, fail versus founders that had to grind out the task themselves. They might not be the best coder or best formulator or whatever for that task itself, but they know how to hire someone and manage them better after they've done the job. And they can call the BS a little bit. And I'm sure that's the same with parenting is once you've done all the tasks yourself, it's easier to hire nannies or help or schools and whatnot.
Yeah. I mean, in some scenarios, I would feel bad to hire a nanny to put 2 kids to bed. And then I thought, wait, I do that. Like, why can't someone else? Or the flip side, if your nanny can do it, you sure as heck can do it. And thinking about, I was at a women's circle the other day and everyone was like, you're such an expander because you have 3 kids and I see that it's possible. And I also thought of the thing of our grandparents had like 10. They'd be laughing so hard that we were applauding each other for having 3 or even 2 or something like that.
Yeah.
It's all a mind shift, I think.
For
Once
sure.
you think that you can do it, you can do it. But if you don't think you can do it, probably not going to have more kids.
Not to make this a self-help talk that you can do it, like the little engine that could. Let's talk about the concrete stuff. So you felt like it was hard to have 1. How was 2? Was 2 easier already?
It was interesting. I thought 2 would be super easy, but in a way, it's not surprising it wasn't because you have a newborn, but now you have a toddler. So even though you've done a newborn before, you've never done a newborn and a toddler. Whereas when you have 3, you've already done a newborn and a toddler, and now you're just throwing in another toddler. I think another thing that also was something to think about is for men, especially 2 might feel hard because 1, the woman's doing a lot of the work with 1. With 2, you guys kind of have to both be giving 100%. And so if you don't have a helpful, supportive partner, it can probably feel really hard and you probably won't have more than 2.
I think a guy's perspective for sure is that the first 6 months you can do almost or very little. I mean, I would take the kids for a walk so you could sleep, but I couldn't do much, to be honest. Even the first year. But after that, you can do a lot. You can go in the park and do all kinds of stuff. And the kid is maybe less mommy centric and wanting mommy all the time. And when the kids are 2, 3, they get older, seem to be like they're more and more want to hang out with dad too. So I'm sure that helps.
Yeah. Another thing was like people imagine their second baby is going to be similar to the first. And they're like, this is easy. I've done it before. But usually second baby is like a 180 from first baby. And you're like, oh no, I'm doing it all again. And nothing that worked in the past works now.
For
I think
sure.
that's true with our 2. Banyan and Bodhi have like almost opposite everything.
Yes. Other thing is, hey, what you looking?
What's your perspective?
Yeah. Maybe finish off on 3 and what was the shift with 3?
Yeah, I was not worried about 3 up until like the last couple weeks before I gave birth. All of a sudden I was like, 2 still feels so hard. How am I going to do 3? But it was obviously too late to do anything about it. And then interestingly enough, the minute I gave birth, I felt like 2 was so easy. So it had to have been a mindset shift and a expanded capacity for what I was able to do. Because there's no other explanation for why 2 felt so hard, and then the next day it felt super easy to have 2.
Yeah. It's sometimes amazing what startups can do with very little money and very few employees, and how much money large companies spend and how many tens of thousands of employees they have and nothing gets done. And I think it's the sense of urgency. When you have a month left of money for payroll, you sometimes pull rabbits out of hats. And I think it's similar to parenting, is when you have one child, you can helicopter parent them. You can delay things like potty training and sleep training. It's like, oh, I got it, because you can use that time that you have as a crutch. But when you start to have 2, 3, I can only imagine how it's to have like 8. You don't have time. You don't have that crutch. So it's similar as a startup. You don't have money. As a parent, you don't have time. You have to get it done. And I think that happens, at least with 3, I've noticed, is that like, you just don't have the luxury to wobble. You got to potty train, you got to sleep train, you got to do these things, because like otherwise it
won't function.
It won't function.
Yeah.
So, and you can't helicopter parent anymore when you have more kids, and you get used to, it's already messy and chaotic. So
Yeah.
you kind of roll with the bunches. So I think the sense of urgency is one of the things that happens more.
Yeah, and I think arguably our 3rd baby is the chillest. And I see this on Instagram. A lot of people say their 3rd baby. And maybe it's because you stopped helicoptering so much.
Yeah.
The first kid is just helicoptered to the point where they're always needing somebody around, because someone's always around. Whereas 3rd baby, we sometimes leave him somewhere and I forget about him, and sometimes he just goes to sleep.
What advice would you have for mamas out there, either thinking if they should have more kids, or if they have however many kids they have, on how to make it easier for themselves?
My advice is more about just motherhood in general than based on if you want more. But I think embracing the chaos and kind of surrendering and just being in it, like super present in the moment, not worrying about past or future, and allowing a little bit of chaos and messiness in the life, because or you can't hypothesize what kids are going to do. They're just going to do stuff, and you got to be present and fun in there. But I mean, multiple kids is not for everyone. I think it's definitely important to think about what's your capacity and what can you give.
My advice would be in the similar theme about, like, a lot of people who, when they have 1 or sometimes even 2 kids, they want to cling on to the life before kids, and they want to keep all the activities. But assume that you had 100% of your time used before you had kids, and then you introduce kids, then obviously something has to give. And just like valuing the first 4 or 5 years being extra magical, and then they start having their own life and it's a magical in another way. Certain things when the kids are very young is this magical period that you will just have less other things, maybe social activities. I think you can still be healthy and you can work, but like something has to give. And I think that's when you have multiple kids, you adjust to that. And when you have 1, you try to cling on to the life before kids more. We still travel and do a lot of stuff, exercise, but yeah, some things obviously has to go. And with 1 kid, I don't think people accept that reality, and I didn't accept the reality.
Yeah.
But with 2 and 3, you kind of have to accept the reality.
So you think with 1, you're kind of trying to do too much?
Yes.
And compromising everything?
Yeah.
Instead of just fully going for it. I also think it took 3, for some reason, for us to really prioritize each other's alone time and allowing the other person to be alone and you be with all the kids. I think we didn't start doing that until 3, maybe out of necessity, like you say. And then we'd allow each other to go to the gym, get a massage, have a day of meditation, whatever it took, and the other person's with all 3.
Remember when we had Banyan, and I would have to wake up at night same time as you wake up, so both of us would be up just as a
Just
punishment.
nice to punish each other,
That was just a month.
That
but-
was you wanted to sympathetic eat with me, so I was having you sympathetic stay up at night.
Yeah, but you're right, is like at some point you realize that, okay,
Yeah,
you got to divide and conquer.
divide and conquer was really
Cool.
took 3 for us to decide that.
Also, I feel emotionally good about 3 because you're in zone defense versus man coverage. is that you can miss some coverages. You know, if you make a mistake, that's okay because you were playing zone, you can't cover two. But
Yeah.
if you miss on man coverage, that's on you. That's a dude
Yeah,
thing.
it's a chaos. But again, you're juggling, and you just, if you believe and you stay in the flow, then all the balls stay in the air.
Yeah.
But if you hesitate, the balls fall down.
You definitely have to be optimistic, similar to a startup founder. You have to believe, be a
Yes.
believer and optimist that
Yeah.
you can get it done. Often, like folks like Elon Musk say they can build a rocket in a year, and then it takes a year and a half. But then Boeing says it takes 10 years to build a rocket, then it takes 20 or something. I might have messed up the amounts, but the idea is like overly optimistic, you'll still land in a better place than like being pessimistic. So I think that's also a similarity.
And also thinking about what's the worst that could happen. Like one of my favorite moments was when we were with your friend who has 6 kids, and we said something about like we don't want to stay out too late, but you wanted to go. I wanted to stay out. You wanted to go home, and I said I don't want to be blamed for whatever happens. And he went, "What's gonna happen?" And that was like the best turning moment for me of like, yeah, what is the worst that's gonna happen? We might be uncomfortable for a couple hours, and there's a couple meltdowns. But
Yeah.
that's the worst. And there's
Pretty
another bedtime tomorrow. There's 7 more bedtimes this week. There's, 365 more bedtimes to ruin this year. So what if one went wrong?
So that was it. I firmly believe kids and startups are meant to scale. The more kids you have and the further the startup goes, the better it goes. And you build momentum. You also have the constraints, built urgency. Hopefully this was helpful to you if you're considering having more kids, or if you just have a lot of kids and sometimes struggle with it. Thanks for joining. Hit like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in one of my other videos. Ciao, ciao.